see you guys in the dark.
I seem to be a magnet for creeps and weirdos. And since I got such a positive response to my last experience, I figured that I would share a few more. For the background, these all took place outside of my home at the time, which was on the literal last block of a major city, right across the street from the beach. The building was framed on four sides by the beach, the woods, a construction site, and a few other sleepy houses, as well as a Mooney line. Think the subway, but above ground. It's the very last stop, so unless you catch it the right time of day, or at the height of the tourist season, the area is basically empty on the sidewalks. The house itself has an initial patio door, and then an entry area with a staircase, and leading up to a second door that leads to the apartment. My first experience. I get home from work one day at about 9 p.m., immediately get into a small spat with my roommates. After about 30 minutes, I decide to leave the house to cool off. I had planned on sitting on the porch outside, but as I looked across the street at the ocean, I decided that it would be more peaceful there. I had never been to the beach at night, for safety, of course, but as I looked at the well-lit parking lot and no one in sight, I decided that it would be all right. In the 1 block span from the beach to my house, there was a little wooded path that started on my street and dumped you out at the sidewalk for the beach. It also intersected with another pathway that took you down to the coast. I sat for a bit. Everything was fine, and after a while, I started the 1-minute walk back to the little path. All of a sudden, I look up. I see a man walking briskly on the intersection path, looking right at me. I speed up a bit and try to ignore him. And as we hit the intersection where the two paths intersect, I end up being about a foot away from him. He calls out to me, "Hey, I want to talk to you." I ignored him, and after a few more steps, he reaches out his hand, grabs part of my hair, saying, "Hey, come here." I immediately yank my hair out of his hand and book it the last block, sprinting to my house. I can hear him running behind me. I turn the corner sharply and am briefly out of his sight. Luckily, the initial entryway to the patio had been left open by accident, and I run in through the door, slam it shut. I hear his footsteps stop outside, followed by silence. As I go upstairs and look through our front window, I see him walking away onto the construction site. My second experience. I had a friend that lived a couple of blocks from where I was, along the same stretch of beach. After hanging out one day, I decided to come back home around sunset. I've walked this route many times, and it's just barely light outside still. Only a 5-minute walk. So I figured that I'll be home before dark. As I crossed the intersection from their house, I noticed a white van parked on the corner that is not usually there. I can just barely make out 2 people in the front seat. I think that it's odd. Okay, whatever. Pull out my pepper spray. I cross the street, passing the van, and I now have my back to it. As soon as my foot hits the pavement on the other side of the street, I hear the van start up. I turn my head just slightly and see them illegally turning to the street where I am now walking. They creep beside me slowly, just behind me, but within my peripheral vision. I decide to stop and let them pass. I pause and pretend to be looking at my phone, see them stop driving immediately. This was a nope from me. I broke into a run. The van decided to follow me to a small village motel about 1 building away that I know has an open entrance courtyard. So as I approach it, I turn quickly into the yard, run up to an archway entry for a unit. I stop at the first few steps, catching my breath. I open my phone's front camera to use it as a sort of a mirror to see what the van is doing. They had backed up to the entry of the motel and sat there for a few minutes. Then the one on the passenger side opened the door, started walking towards the motel. His phone flashlight was on. I immediately pulled down my phone, listening for his footsteps and readying my stuff to banging on the motel door, hoping someone was inside. I wait in silence for a long time, long enough for it to get dark. I finally look out again, and both the man and the van are gone. I call an Uber to take the last 2 blocks. Never saw them again. My third experience. I have a friend over, and we want to dab. It's about 10 p.m. My roommates don't like dabbing in the house because of the smell, so he and I go to his car parked out front. We're in there, having a good time, when I notice a person walking down the block, pulling on the car door handles. I notify him, and we watch him as the same person comes up to his car and yanks on his back door. He honks his horn. They back up for a moment, then walk up to his driver window and knock on the window, making a motion to roll it down. Just as I am about to tell him don't, he rolls down the window a little bit. The person is clean, in normal clothing, asks what day it is, and then what time it is, to which my friend answers. They then stand there and stare at us as he tries to usher them away. After offering them some money, without saying anything, they walk down the block, and once they reach the intersection between the construction site and woods, they roll their head back up to the sky and just scream at the top of their lungs. As they back away out of sight, I take this opportunity to dart back inside my house as my friend watches, making sure to close the patio door. A few hours later, one of my roommates comes home very drunk. As we figured later, they failed to make sure that the patio door shut all the way. Morning time comes, and I wake up in an empty apartment. I open up my phone and have a singular message from my roommate from 3 hours ago, stating that when they left for work this morning, there was a person they didn't know sleeping inside the patio area. They thought that it was a drunk person who lived in the neighborhood and entered the wrong house by mistake. Evidently did not find it enough of a reason to call me or wake me up. I immediately go to the entry of our apartment, pulling the door open fast. To my surprise, the person who had been talking to us in the car that night before is laying casually across my staircase, fiddling with something. I scream, "Hey!" loudly. They immediately hop up and run out my patio door. I run down the stairs after them, open up the door. They are standing across the street, just smiling at me and giggling. They then give me a little wave and then run off. I close the door hard and go back up the steps to see what items they had left. Sitting on the steps was a few coins, some weird wire-type objects, a lighter, and a pocket knife. I never did see them again. Unrelated to my stories, but shortly after I moved from that area, a teenage girl was abducted from that same corner where I saw the van. After a car chase, the police found a severed head in the freezer of a house along my block as well. I'm currently in my 30s, and I suppose your average male living in the Midwestern United States. Regular job, regular life. I simply hope for the best, try to remain positive, and try to live and let live. I do have one thing that, when it is brought up, turns me into a frightened 4-year-old, shaking, stressed, and worried. The year was 1983. I was 4 years old. Very happy and very trusting until the fateful day that I was made aware of this strange man. It was Thanksgiving, and we made the trip to visit my mother's side of the family. We were at her grandparents' house. At the time, I was an only child, and as a matter of fact, the only child there. I remember being bored after everyone had eaten, and asked my dad to take me to a large, well-known park in the area. It stood out due to the fact that it had giant animals that were part of the park. A penguin with a slide in its stomach, an elephant that you could climb up with the help of a ladder, a kangaroo that you could somehow bounce in. Anyways, you get the point. My dad jumped at the chance to get out of the house and away from everyone. He was a stranger here. There were in-laws he never really knew, cousins, aunts, and uncles, great-grandparents, not to mention the friends of these people, all really tight-knit and knowing each other for years. We arrived at the park, and my first impression when pulling up was the number of kids running around. I noticed the occasional parent as well, keeping a watchful eye on their children. My dad told me that he would watch me from the car, and to go have fun with the other kids. I jumped out of the back seat and scrambled to the penguin first. I remember bonding with the other kids. I have of course never met any of them before, but kids seem to be a natural tendency to flock together. Trust one another and simply play. I was running around like most of the children, going from the slides to the swings, and eventually grew tired and sat on a bench. It had only been about 15 minutes since I had arrived, and was planning on being there for several more hours. I then noticed him, a man that stood out. I could tell even as a 4-year-old that he did not belong here. He was dressed in a trench coat, a hat that matched, and kept looking around, staring at different kids. In my childlike mind, he resembled Inspector Gadget. I knew immediately that he was up to no good. He was looking for an unintended child. He then eyed me, my dad being in the car several hundred yards away. He made the mistaken assumption that I had somehow, as a 4-year-old, made it to the park alone. I was then on high alert. I tried to start playing again, but all the joy of the day had been sucked out by this creep. I went down a slide, only to see that he had skulked over to me like a wraith, watching and waiting. I couldn't bear the tension or the fear, so I ran as fast as possible back to the safety of my father and the car. I jumped into the back seat, head down as to keep me hidden from his view. I told my dad I was ready to go back to my great-grandmother's house and was relieved as we started pulling away. My curiosity took over, and I peeked my head above the back seat of the car and looked out of the back window. He was there, looking directly at me and making a come here motion with his finger, all the while smiling. I ducked even lower and remained that way until we arrived back at my grandparents' home. I have no reason why I failed to tell anyone what had happened. Maybe a fear that it would somehow bring me closer to him, or that I wouldn't be believed. I forgot about this strange man, or at least didn't think that I would be seeing him again. Flash forward to 1986. My parents and I moved into a low-rent apartment. I'm fine at first. Everything's normal. I then noticed one day that our neighbors had moved out, and then a new neighbor had moved in. One guess as to who it was. Everything came back to me in a flash. I freaked out, but for some reason kept it all to me, not saying a word to anyone. I tried to avoid him, and hoped that he wouldn't remember me from that brief moment a few years before. I was sadly mistaken. As soon as he saw me, I saw a look of recognition on his narrow face. I didn't play alone after that. As a matter of fact, I didn't go outside really unless my parents were there with me. Several months had passed, and of course I was still on the defense, just waiting for the worst to happen. One day, though, I noticed something odd. He had a boy with him, roughly my age, and clearly scared. The child was rarely seen, and when seen, the man had a firm grasp on him at all times. My mother not apparently picking up on the fact that this man was a sick freak. In my mind, the boogeyman told me that I should go next door to his apartment and ask to play with what she thought was his son. Nope, never even thought of doing such an absurd thing, and refused without telling her why. I remember seeing the boy a few more times over the course of what had to have been weeks, and I always remember the look on his face, the fact that he wanted to tell me something, that he was afraid. It haunts me to this day, even though I was just a child. I'm still filled with guilt for not saying anything. It was because I was afraid for my life, afraid of whatever the hell that strange monster of a man wanted to do with me and boys like me. I last saw the boy in the man's car. It was an old, cream-colored 60s model. The boy was crying and looked out of his mind. I stored this memory away and hid it, the darkness of the moment too big for my childlike mind to understand. Eventually the beast moved away, and soon after, we did as well. I was growing up. Years had passed. I was a big boy, or so I thought. 3rd grade maybe, and my parents had just taken pictures of me playing, being a kid. Just regular family stuff. The man was lost in my memories, fading slowly, but of course never fully forgotten. The photos were developed by a local grocer. They were picked up and looked over and left on the dash of my parents' car. When we went to a park in my city, it was summer. My parents and I got out of the car and did our tour of the park. The car windows were left down. No reason to suspect anything foul happening. I remember we were at the top of the park, on a large rocky hill, and looking down. Wouldn't you know who was there? The man, dressed in a long coat again, but much shabbier, trash-eating, looking quite disheveled and dirty. I remember being afraid, but happy in a strange way as seeing him so down and out, homeless and hungry. The guy then saunters over to my parents' car, looks in, reaches for something, and makes off. It was the photos of me. My parents yelled and were upset, but as mentioned earlier, we were way above him. And the hill we were on turned into a sheer cliff. The drop was at least 30 feet. You would have to walk completely back around to catch him. My father tried, but by the time that he got to the car, the fiend was gone. My dad came back to us. We drove home. My parents chalked it up to random chance. They had no memory of this man. They only saw a mental case, homeless and lost. I processed the whole thing and freaked knowing that he was still so close. Years had gone by, and of course, naturally me thinking he was long gone, or dead, or at least not able to magically appear where I was and steal my photos. It's now 1989, and we live in a different house, same city. I'm much bigger, and of course, we're aware of the world, the positives and the negatives. It was summer. My parents had spent a late night with their longtime friends. It was about 1 a.m. before we began making our way back home. I was wide awake, staring out the window, eating up the world's visuals with my eyes, and all of a sudden, out of nowhere, was the stranger, once again dressed in the same get-up as before. I almost shrieked in the back seat, but instead remained quiet and hid, praying that he didn't see me. I did notice, though, that he was walking rather quickly, as if he was on a mission to bring fear into the hearts of children everywhere. My parents take notice and comment of how odd it is that he's dressed in a winter coat and hat in the summertime, but don't seem to realize that this is the same man we'd seen seemingly out of nowhere countless times before. I believe that he didn't see me, and I sat up again as we made our way up the street. We then saw her, a 13 or 14-year-old girl, crying and running like her life depending on it. She kept looking back, looking for someone or something. I knew what she was looking for, and I was afraid for her. I remember my parents asking if she needed help, a ride, something. She flatly refused any help and kept on running. I don't know what she thought we were up to, but I'm guessing whatever the man had said to her put true fear into her heart, and she wasn't going to trust anyone or anything at that moment. I never had another incident with this dark version of Inspector Gadget, and at times wonder what became of him. I sometimes feel the need to research the newspapers, internet, old phone books, anything to discover who he was and what he may have done to the boy I saw, and maybe others. I usually begin looking, but never find anything substantial. That may be by unconscious choice, though, as opposed to anything else. This happened a few weeks ago. I'm 24 and female. Probably couldn't defend myself against a 10-year-old if I tried. I went to the grocery store to pick up some things the other night. When I got to the register, there was a man helping bag my groceries while the cashier was checking me out. I was buying some dog treats. He asked me what kind of dog I had. I said a golden doodle. And he said, "Oh my God, me too." I didn't really get an off vibe from him, but he would stare and not break eye contact at all. I chalked it up to him missing social cues and trying to be friendly. After I paid, he started pushing the cart for me out of the door. This isn't uncommon. They typically help you take your things to your car. I have social anxiety and feel very awkward and guilty having them do that for me, so I always say that I'm good, but thank you so much. Every other time, they've said, "Okay, have a good one." When I said that I'm good to this guy, he said, "No, I got it," very bluntly, and stared at me the whole time. I instantly got a bad vibe. It was about 8 at night, and barely anyone was there. He said, "Well, my shift is over, so I'm walking to my car anyways." Weird, because he didn't clock out, but maybe he had before he did the last checkout. He was very talkative in the store, asking tons of questions about my dog and telling me about his. But when we got outside, he barely said much. I started asking questions about his dog because I felt anxious with the silence. But I really regret that. He took it as an interest. He immediately said, "Well, if you give me your number, you can meet him," and just stared yet again. I said, "Oh, I'm sorry. I don't give my number to strangers." I didn't want to say no because I have a boyfriend. Because he seemed like he might get angry over all of that. I don't know. It's just the feeling of the moment. We had loaded all the groceries into the trunk, and I was thinking, thank God that I got out of here now. But no, the cart was between me and him, and he was positioned on the driver's side. So in order to get my door, I would have to go right past him. I said, well, I gotta go home. My dog is waiting for his treats. He just stared at me. I realized I was going to have to go past him if I wanted to leave. So I looked around to see if anyone else was in the parking lot in case something more happened. No one was there. I started to get extremely nervous. He could push the cart into me or just grab me himself. I have had a traumatic experience before, and my problem is that I don't have fight or flight. I just freeze. Just like that, he walked away, pushing the cart to where they are returned in the parking lot. I took the chance to get into my car. I locked the doors immediately. I wished that I had left then, but I needed a moment to breathe. I saw in my side mirror he was getting into his car. I quickly put the car in drive and drove out. The exit is a stoplight, and just my luck, it's red. I'm turning left. I see his car right behind me, not 30 seconds later. I panicked, but then thought that he said he's going home. It's nothing. I only live 2 minutes from the grocery store. I made the turn, and he was hanging back. I didn't put my blinker on for the next turn. He made it too. The next turn was a stoplight, and then the turn for my road. As I get to the light, it's red again. I thought maybe that I should drive to a police station just in case. But as soon as that thought came, the light went green. My boyfriend and I only moved here 2 months ago, so I couldn't think in my head how to get to the station. And I'm terrible at using my phone while driving. I'm not even 30 seconds from the last turn onto our street. Our street is a dead end with only 4 houses on it. It's very long, and we are at the end. No one goes down it unless they live there, or are lost. I turn, and he makes the turn too. Fuck, I think. I literally just directed him to my house. Thankfully, I have Bluetooth, so I called my boyfriend. I said a guy from the grocery store is following me. Turn all the lights on, open the gate, and let Nick out. Nick is his German Shepherd, and he is trained to be a German police dog, and then got extra bite training. He could hold someone for up to 6 hours. So now knowing he was outside, I wasn't nervous. I was nervous that my boyfriend wouldn't have gotten the gate open in time, and I would have to either sit in my car or get out fast and put the code in. As I pulled up, I saw the gate was open. Thank God. My boyfriend was on the front porch with Nick on a leash, and his gun was in the air. I fly through and down the driveway. This fucker follows me. Does he not see the gun and the guard dog? Well, he did at that moment, because my boyfriend let Nick go, and he charged the car. Jumped up at the driver window, frothing at the mouth, showing all of his teeth and hair on his back standing up. He looked terrifying, even to me, and he was protecting me. I gave Nick his command to come back, hoping this guy got the hint that if he gets out of the car, he will die. He did. He reversed the car so damn fast out of the driveway that he nearly hit the gate. I collapsed on the front porch and hugged my boyfriend. Nick got a steak for dinner. I reported the man to the grocery store because I remembered his name on his name tag purposefully. They later contacted me that he had been served termination papers and will no longer be working there. So when I was about 14, I went to the store with my mother. It was mid-July, I believe. Something like that. It was a hot summer day, and we had just gone into the store. The produce aisles were right there by the door. They were really narrow, just enough room to push a shopping cart through. I was wearing shorts and a school tee. Well, this man comes in. He was in his mid-40s, really scruffy looking, gray pepper hair, kinda average weight. Well, he looks around, then at me. I didn't really pay it much attention, and was helping my mom find vegetables and stuff. Next thing I know, I feel a gust of wind hit my back. He was right behind me. He breathes down my neck and says, goddamn. Looks at my ass. Mind you, I'm 14, so I was scared and in shock. So I look at my mom in horror as this man is centimeters away from touching me. She grits her teeth and tells him to fuck off before she calls the cops. Well, he walks off with a smug look and goes into another aisle. So we talk for a minute about it and go back to looking for our things so that we can get the hell out of there. Then we look over and he's peeking at me from around the aisle. Then I look down. He was jerking off to a preteen. What the fuck? So my mom picks up a can of peas. naturally, and throws it at this man's head. It misses him because he dodges, and he books it out of the store. She called the cops, but they never got back to us, so I'm pretty sure that they never found him. Needless to say, I've been scared ever since, and no longer wear shorts or anything that shows too much skin anymore. I know I didn't do anything wrong. It was summer, hot, and I was just a kid. But it makes me feel like I was one of those people who asked for it somehow, by simply wearing shorts. I just wanted to feel comfortable that day. Back in the mid-90s, my family had lived on the island in BC, and my stepdad had gotten a job at the main Toronto University, and we were to move that summer. I was 13 at the time, not prepared for what a large city had lined up. The trip was long, and I ended up grounded before we even got there. Something about running away and a tantrum on the ferry early on. But in the building we lived there was a yard, and kids played baseball, and I was excited. In my first month, this one tall kid threatened me with a large hunting knife, which led on charges. And that following summer, and next summer, I had been approached by 2 pedophiles. Never have I ever. The first incident, I was at an arcade, and played pinball a lot. This older guy had chatted me up, saying how he needed help moving some stuff, and would pay me $50. I was like, hell yeah, why not? So we left, and we went around to the back alley where I guess I used up one of my 9 lives. Because I got in his car, and he got in, turns to me and says, actually, there are no boxes. I just wanted to suck your dick a little bit. I was stunned. Then I jumped out, yelled you freak, and then ran off. Who knows what could have happened there. The next time it happened again at the arcade, which I guess is a staging ground for them. But this one guy started chatting me up. But he definitely played a long game. He apparently had an independent record label for indie bands. And after a little while, had asked me if I'd put up posters for him, and then I'd get paid. I agreed and did that. I'd go around putting them up, marking the address, and thought that I was doing a good job and would get paid. After a while, this person, we'll call Dave, would be a little friendlier, and he would ask when I was going to visit him at his place and come hang out. I was like, nah, avoided that, and he eventually found out that I played chess. Started to bring that up too. One day we went to the library and played chess. I figured it was a public enough place. We played, and on the last game he was making a bet, and bet me if he won that I'd have to go visit him at his place. I have no idea why it was made, but in the end I managed to draw the game. After that last encounter, I distanced myself, and stopped seeing him in general. For sure he was a predator, and I dodged that one. Years later, when I was 16, I got an email from him. It said how he was aware of a certain amount of internet activities, and had to talk to him, especially if I wanted to be safe. I was not having any of that, and responded immediately telling him that I knew he was a pedophile, and that if he ever tried to talk to me or blackmail me, I was going to go to the police, and tell them about him and his advances. I was scared, and he never contacted me again. But now that I'm an adult, I realize maybe I should have told the cops, and hoped that no one else had to deal with that creep. You should know that my mom had a brother who died of a heart attack in 2005. He was in his late 40s and left behind his 2 kids and his wife. His children, Ron and Christy. Christy was older than Ron and I by 4 years. She had just had a baby a year prior to all of this. Their mom is my Aunt Sheila. When my uncle passed, the entire family broke apart. He and my aunt, and Ron, all lived in the house my grandmother had purchased since my grandma no longer lived there. She decided to snowbird with my grandfather a few years before this. After my uncle passed, getting in contact with Sheila, Christy, and Ron became progressively more difficult. We wanted to be there for them, and my mom, who was very good friends with Sheila, felt like she needed her too. But that wasn't happening. Nothing was as it seemed. One day, after many calls went unanswered, my mom and I drove to the house my aunt, Christy, Ron, and Christy's baby were staying in, to find most of their belongings gone, and the house was destroyed. Curtains were ripped from the walls. Tables were flipped. The garage window was smashed. Other than that, it was just overall very unclean, and we could tell that my grandmother's house was not being taken care of prior to whatever the hell had happened in the past 2 weeks to make it look broken into. Which at first we thought it was broken into. When we saw all the belongings were missing, we knew that Sheila and the kids had just left. We called every phone number we could looking for them, until finally we were able to reach them at Sheila's mother's house in Florida, where she picked up the phone and just said, "Fuck all of you." She then hung up, which was odd since our family had always been so close. We went on vacations every single year, had Friday night sleepovers, and Sunday dinner every week. A lot happened very quickly after that. We found divorce papers in the abandoned home. They were signed only by Sheila. The woman who lived across the street from the house stated she noticed that when Sheila got the mail, she would hide some of the envelopes in her purse. My grandmother noticed a decrease in her finances, and it was soon learned that Sheila was taking checks my grandmother would send for utilities and other house maintenance and house payments, and as a result, this house went into foreclosure. We learned that Sheila had stolen over $15,000 from my grandparents. We learned that Sheila was having an affair prior to my uncle's death with a good friend of his. It was a mess. It took weeks for my mother and I to get that house in preparation to sell, but we finally did. The house sold, but our family was gone, and we were left to sit in a giant puddle of whatever this is. But some people are just bad. Sheila was bad, and able to put up a front and pretend otherwise. She was stealing, cheating, lying for over 5 years that we know of. But she was out of our lives, and we did our best to just move on. Let's talk about Ron. Ron was always a big kid. When he was younger, it took him years to speak words. School teachers and doctors would tell Sheila and my uncle that Ron might have some kind of mild mental retardation, but they didn't accept that. He was never treated for this. When we were teenagers, he had developed a bad temper and would do some things that scared me and my brother. He would throw the house cat, play fight too rough, and do some really inappropriate things. When AOL and AIM was a big thing, Ron would go through my friends list and start talking to my friends in high school. He would tell them that he and I wanted to get together with them. They'd come to school, asking me about it, and I sat there just clueless. He would start conversations in a friendly way, and slowly begin telling them things about his genitals, asking about theirs. And if they asked him to stop, he'd start expressing how hard his life has been, and how nobody loved him. This did not stop after high school. When MySpace and Facebook became a thing, he would continue to go through my pictures and friends and do the same thing. Almost all of my friends ended up blocking him or threatening to end a friendship with me because of what he would do, along with what he would always say. One friend told me that he just showed up to her workplace one day and just watched her. He left after a manager approached him. My friend never wanted to be harsh with him because they knew that he had lost his dad, seen his mom with another man, and above else, probably had some sort of disability. But these girls had boyfriends, and jobs, and a life. Ron was really starting to take a toll on them. Years had passed. We're looking at my early 20s now, and about 6 years ago. My grandparents never blamed their grandkids for the wrongdoing of their mother, and continued to want a relationship with both Ron and Christy. Honestly, I liked it too. Christy had 3 other children at this point, and I loved having them around. Ron was living with Christy and her family. It had been a few years since I had seen them, and I could see that things had changed. He was different, less angry and more patient, kind of sweet. He was a good uncle to Christy's kids. He would make them laugh and carry them on his shoulders. My boyfriend at the time thought Ron was a funny kid, and they became friends. Before I knew it, Ron was spending more and more time at our house. During the time of this story, I had a boyfriend named Greg. He and I lived in an in-law apartment beneath my parents' home. The upstairs had 3 entrances, a front door, a porch, and a garage door, which leads into the family room. Most people come in through the garage door. When you first walk in, you're in my parents' family room, and with a bathroom to the right. The porch is straight ahead. There's another door next to the bathroom, and this leads to my apartment, which I'll get into. My parents' kitchen is a part of the living room, No walls or door dividing it, but there is a door that separates the kitchen from the dining room and the living room. Think one long open floor plan, a hallway that leads to a bathroom on the left, another door where the shower is, and another door where my parents' bedroom is. Back to the hallway, 2 more bedrooms on the right, and my parents' master bedroom is on the left, where my dad keeps a BB gun in his nightstand. Downstairs where I lived is less important to need the layout, but you should know that there is 2 entrances from the outside, and then a staircase that leads upstairs next to one of my parents' bathrooms near the family room. Also note that I have 2 kittens, and my parents have a black lab shepherd mix. I know this may all seem like a lot, but there's a point, I promise, to it. Ron, Greg, and I had been spending a lot of time together. His mom had recently married my uncle's best friend, and he was feeling a bit lost. He would come over to hang out in our apartment, and sometimes sleep there. He would do nice things like make deep-fried Oreos, nachos, and roast beef dinners. At the time, Craig was working part-time at GameStop and going to school full-time. He is a Marine, a big guy. I was working at a daycare for people who had developmental and physical disabilities, and was out of work at 3 p.m. every day. My mom was visiting my grandparents in Florida, and my dad was in between jobs, currently taking care of his uncle an hour away who had Alzheimer's. Ron started staying with us for long periods of time, stating that he didn't feel comfortable at Christie's or with his mom. Greg and I understood completely, and he began staying nights at a time. My mom said that it was fine that he did, as long as he would help walk their dog and do some homework, since Ron did not have a job. I let Ron use my laptop, as I thought it would help him look for new jobs or whatever he wanted to do to fill his days while he was in the house. I was at work when I got a phone call from Greg. He was about to leave from class when 3 police officers arrived at our door. He wouldn't say much, because he didn't know much, but said that they were questioning Ron and taking my computer. Greg didn't have a car, and we shared mine, so I asked him to come pick me up. Without my parents there, I felt it was the responsible thing to do. I get home as the police are leaving. Ron turns to me and just says, "I didn't do anything wrong." A police officer pulled me aside, asking if the laptop was mine. I said yes. He asked if Ron had been using it. I didn't answer him, and instead asked him what this was about. The officer told me that he knew there was something missing in my cousin. It pissed me off that he said that. He told me my cousin was accused of speaking to underage girls on the laptop, and it had to be taken for a few days. Greg and I begged Ron to just tell the truth. If he had done something by accident, or didn't know their age, or if they lied about their age, it was okay, and we could figure it all out. Ron admitted to nothing, boldly stating that he had never interacted with anyone other than people that he knew. He was convincing, and even though I remembered things that he had done in the past, I overruled them with the thought that Ron would never purposely speak to anyone inappropriately if he knew that they were underage. Greg and I started getting more annoyed with Ron. When he walked the dog, he would get annoyed and yell at her if she didn't do her business fast enough. He was eating a good portion of the food we purchased, blasted his music at all hours, and was starting to forget to knock when we were in our bedroom talking or doing other things. One day we finally decided that we had to talk to my parents and have him stay somewhere else. They agreed. I didn't want to tell him, so unfortunately my dad had to. I say unfortunately because my dad is the most non-confrontational, passive, and kind person. I felt wrong about him doing it, but my mom wears the pants here, and she wants it to be him. So a few days after he asked Ron to leave, he did. Ron called me on Friday after I had gotten out of work. He knew Greg worked Friday nights and that my mom was still in Florida, and my dad was still with his uncle during the day. He asked if he could come hang out. I was busy this afternoon, and by busy I mean I was watching Pretty Little Liars and just wanted to relax. I worked a demanding job and was tired. He was frustrated that I said no, saying he could just come by for a little while, but this didn't change my answer. I told him that we could hang out another night. I hung up and laid back down on the couch. I was in my parents' family room. Micah, our dog, was laying on the floor beside me. I heard a sound from downstairs around 4:15 p.m. It had been about a half an hour since Ron had called. It sounded like someone was banging on the walls. My first thought was my cat, so I got up and walked over to the door that leads downstairs. As I opened it, I saw Ron standing at the bottom of the staircase. I asked him what he was doing. He held out a bottle of Dr. Pepper and explained that his mom had dropped him off. I was annoyed. I left the door open, assuming at this point I didn't have a choice but to hang out with him, and I really just wasn't up to company. He went into the porch, lighting a cigarette and telling me how his mom kicked him out for the night because she wanted to have sex with her new husband. He was so angry about it, saying that he couldn't believe that anyone loved him at all. This enraged me, and after years of dislike that I had towards this woman, I took out my phone and called her while Ron was on the porch smoking, and I was in the family room. I explained to her that Ron was no longer supposed to be at my house unless my parents were home, and that they weren't, so she should have just come pick him up. I know this was harsh of me, and I probably sound like a bitch, but honestly, I was so exhausted and really wanted to be by myself. She called me a little cunt. I called her a lying bitch and asked her what kind of mother dumps their kid so that they can fuck someone. She hung up on me. I laughed about it because I never gotten to even give her the tiniest piece of my mind. I went to the porch and told Ron that I kinda yelled at his mom, thinking he might be happy someone stood up for him. Maybe I was also thinking of myself when I stood up for him, but I still did it. Instead, Ron put out his cigarette and began pacing the porch, putting his hands over his head as he did. I knew that I fucked up. I hurt his feelings, and I started something that I shouldn't have. I was being selfish. I apologized to him. His response was throwing the plastic table on the porch against the window and barging out the door leading outside. Now I felt shitty. I called my mom, and she said not to let Ron back in. She had just gotten off the phone with a police officer earlier that afternoon, and they found some really crucial evidence that Ron was knowingly speaking to young girls. She didn't want him in the house and asked that I locked all the doors. So I went around to every single door and locked it. I started upstairs and made my way down. When I had gotten to my apartment, I noticed that my cats weren't inside, begging for snacks like usual. I figured I'd get to the doors after I found them. They were locked in the bathroom. Also in the bathroom were all of Ron's bags, which he carried his belongings in. Sitting on top was a knife. I'm aware that anyone can have a knife, but I didn't like that it just sat on top of the giant bag. So I put it inside his bag, let my cats out of the bathroom, and picked up the bag so that I could maybe place it outside. I went to the garage and put the bag there so that when he needed to come back and get it, I could just unlock the garage door or bring his bag outside to him. An hour had passed. I heard a glass smash from what sounded like behind me. I was now in the family room upstairs again. I heard it again and knew it was coming from the garage. I wanted to open the door, but was scared. After a couple of minutes of silence, I opened it up just a little and saw that the glass window of the garage door had been broken. I heard the sound of someone walking to the outside porch that led outside into the indoor porch. I forgot to lock the door that brings you in that way, but I did lock the glass slider that leads from the porch to the family room. The door opened. Ron just stood there, clenching his fist, which was bleeding at this time. He demanded that I open the door. I shook my head and asked if I should call an ambulance. He started screaming at me, saying that he'll find a way in, and then calling me a little bitch. Just wait until I do. I called my mom, and she told me to dial 911. Then my grandparents intervened, telling me not to. They begged me not to, reminded me that Ron had a temper and disability issues. Now, with the pedophile accusations, he'd surely be looking at prison if I called the police. I was on the other side of the house, near the bedrooms now. I grabbed the BB gun and brought it into my parents' bathroom with me. Micah was close by, panting, but not really doing much else. Everything was silent, and I was starting to think that he had left. I hung up on my mom and grandparents and called my aunt, who lived about 20 minutes away from us. I also called my best friend, who was closer than that. I told them that I didn't know if he was still there, and if he was by the time that they got there, then to disregard my grandparents and call the police, and not step out of their cars. A few moments after hanging up, I heard the sound of things being moved in my apartment. More screaming this time. Ron was saying that he'd break my fingers. And when I moved the BB gun, all the pellets fell out of the back. I had no idea what I was doing. It was quiet again, and I heard my downstairs door to the outside slam shut. I got up and ran to the living room upstairs, looking and watching as Ron climbed the driveway, with his bag in his hand. A few minutes later, my aunt and best friend showed up at the same time. We walked around the house and saw that he had broken the storage window, one of my downstairs bedroom windows, and had smeared his blood all over my furniture, my bed sheets, and my doors. I should have called the police, but there was a part of me that felt guilty, felt bad for him, and there still is a part of me that does, but I should have just called the police. I wish this was the end of that. The police did not clear my laptop, but suggested that I did clear it. A few weeks after this, I went to log into my own Gmail and saw that the computer was still logged into Ron's. I read the conversations for myself and knew that these little girls and boys were victims, and he was preying on them. Not only that, but I saw that he was sending multiple pictures of me, some with clothing, some not, some sleeping, some changing out of my clothes. Most taken from outside, and was sending them to complete strangers. He told them that he fucked me all the time, and that I was his cousin, like he was proud of this. He even showed pictures of Christy's kids to these people, saying he wanted to touch them too. The responses from some of these people were in agreement with him regarding the fact that he had sex with his cousin, and enjoyed looking and being around children. I'm a female, and when I was a child, around 10 years old, my parents ran a construction business. This had several employees on the payroll at any given time, mostly to drive gravel or cement trucks for them. My dad is a kind but naive man who'd often hire friends of friends who were down on their luck to give them a chance to get back on their feet. It never worked out well, because my dad somehow always gets linked up with the scrungiest of people. They had a lot of creeps over the years, but I think the worst one might have been Ben. Ben was a friend of my dad's dad, who also worked for us. Ben supposedly had an old work injury that made it difficult for him to work any job where he had to be on his feet all day. My grandfather begged my dad to give him a job as a driver, and my dad finally agreed. From the day that she met him, Ben had made my mom extremely uncomfortable. He just had one of those weird vibes that you can't explain, and everybody but my dad picked up on it. Like I said, my dad is extremely naive. Mom wouldn't let me and my younger sister around him for any length of time. We were homeschooled at the time, and my mom worked in the office, so we were around quite a bit. She kept telling my dad that we should let him go, but my dad wouldn't because he said that he didn't have any legitimate reason to fire him. This is the weird part. Whenever my sister and I were at the office on a slow day, my grandfather would always try to come get us over and sit with him and Ben. He would always ask, "Don't you want to go for a ride with us in the big truck?" Ben himself couldn't talk to us. He let my grandfather handle that. We were shy kids, so we never agreed to it. But he was so damn persistent. It reached a point where it was literally every single time he saw us there. My sister and I would take turns hiding in the bathroom so that we didn't have to go and be around them. They'd always do it when my mom was out of the room, and they'd back off whenever she was around. My dad was never around when it happened, and I don't think that he believed it. I mean, who wants to believe that? My mom eventually had enough and told my dad that Ben had to go. A few years later, we found out that Ben had taken a young girl. My grandfather had another friend who had a daughter about my age, out for a ride in the truck, and molested her. My grandfather was enabling him the whole time. I shudder to think what would have happened if my mom hadn't watched out for us. And yes, to answer the question, I do believe my grandfather was a pedo as well, not just an enabler. And I think deep down my dad absolutely knew it. It was common rumor in my community growing up that my grandfather had molested my aunt when she was a child. None of the family ever talked about it, other than my mom, who was a hero, and would never let things go. She always asked my dad, and he'd just say that he didn't know, and then change the subject. The fact that he didn't immediately jump to defend his dad against accusations that serious is a red flag. I know I have no contact with my grandfather or the rest of that side of the family, and my life is much better for it. I grew up in a small town in Pennsylvania. In the center of town was the post office, the fire hall, a store, and a bar. The bar was a rooming house. The second story consisted of 7 rooms. Men could rent monthly. My friend and I, all 12-year-old boys, would hang out around the post office, skateboarding after school. One day we started hearing someone whistling, the weet-woo cat calling whistle, over and over. We figured out that it was coming from one of the rooms upstairs above the bar. We ignored it, but it was pretty weird. The next day on the bus to school, a girl handed me a flannel shirt that I must have left down by the post office. I noticed that there was something in the front pocket. It was a few pieces of paper folded up. I started to open it and realized there was a magazine picture of a naked man wrapped up in the papers. A Playgirl picture. I hurried up and put it in my backpack. When I got home, I opened it back up. There was a picture and a note. He knew my name, and he talked about enjoying watching me and my friends. I can't really remember exactly what it said. Needless to say, it did freak me out. I walked down the road from my house, burnt the picture and the note. The whistling continued, and he would even drive behind my bus when I was getting out of school. I eventually did tell my parents, and they did call the police, who came over and asked me questions. Unfortunately, I had burnt the evidence that would have been used. Now my dad went to the bar often, and everyone who lived above the bar drank at the bar. I'm not sure if he ever had words with the guy or not. My dad was not a guy who backed down from a fight, so I'm kind of surprised nothing like that happened. Eventually the guy moved out of town, and I never saw him again. Actually, I really wouldn't know if I had, since I never got a real good look at him. For all I know, he's still watching me. That was over 20 years ago. For my first job right out of high school, I worked at a fast food chain. None of us at the restaurant knew each other before then, but we quickly became a little group that had a great time together. Spent our minimum wage on getting drunk at house parties after work. One of these particular friends, let's call him R, was your typical awkward, funny gay friend. The type of guy that was friends with everyone. Quirky was just his personality. He was a floater, never really held down a job or a stable home. Always moving around between friends' houses and stuff like that. We wouldn't see R often, but we remained close and in contact, like with Facebook and Snapchat. He was invited to big events like weddings, birthdays, and New Year's Eve parties. He would stay at my house, and he was known as uncle to my kids. Early this year, a couple of us became concerned when we couldn't get in contact with him. After some searching, one of our friends told us that they found R and that he was in jail. Long story short, he had been involved in a massive pedophile ring spanning several countries. He was found to have been making and in possession of child pornography and bestiality. To say I was fucking shocked doesn't even begin to cover it. My world shattered in that moment. Months later, I still can't fathom it. He is yet to be sentenced, but no punishment fits the crime that has been committed. I'm broken for the families that he hurt. I'm in disbelief that someone I thought that I knew in and out, I actually knew nothing about. But most of all, there is a burning rage inside of me. A part of me that wishes I could turn back time to the last time that I saw him, knowing what I know now. The hardest part is that looming realization that you cannot trust a soul, because you never truly know a person. If you enjoyed this video, please subscribe, like, and hit the bell for notifications on future videos, and become a stalker of the night. And I'll see you next time.